4 years ago, I married my husband, Lucas, and back then everything felt perfect. We met at a coffee shop where he worked as a barista, and I stopped by for a latte before work. In this story, I will tell you how my life changed because of one weekend. Sit back and enjoy. My name's Ethan, I'm 32 years old, and I live in a small house in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. He was tall, with chestnut hair and a soft smile that made me feel wanted. Those first years, we were inseparable, spending nights talking and watching movies. But over time, something broke, and I didn't catch when it started. It had been 10 days since Lucas last touched me, even by mistake. Not in bed, not at breakfast, not even in that offhand way couples do after years together. He'd turned into a stranger, someone who stared at his phone more than at me. I used to matter to him, but now I felt like part of the furniture in our house. We stopped fighting because there was nothing left to fight over. Silence became a constant guest, and I started thinking it'd stay that way forever. That changed when Lucas mentioned his stepbrother Seth was coming over for the weekend. I nodded, figuring it wouldn't make a difference, just another person in the house. Seth rolled in Friday afternoon, and I opened the door, not expecting anything big. He stood there with a suitcase in one hand and a backpack in the other. The first thing I noticed was his dark hair, a little messy, and gray eyes that locked right onto mine. He was lean, with some stubble, wearing black jeans and a white t-shirt that hugged his frame. "You're Ethan, right?" he said, stepping inside like he already knew the place. His voice was deep, a bit rough, like he'd just finished singing. "Lucas talked about you, but you look better than I pictured," he added with a smile, and I laughed, not sure what to say. He dropped his stuff by the couch and hugged me, tight, pressing his whole body against mine. I felt the warmth of his breath on my neck, and it threw me off balance. "It's been ages since I crashed at a real house. You guys live like grown-ups?" he said, pulling back and eyeing me with curiosity. Lucas came downstairs in his usual shirt, buttoned all the way up, and shot Seth a look full of irritation. "You're here early," he mumbled, and Seth fired back, "and you're late as usual," winking at me while peeling off his sneakers. They stood side by side, and it was hard to believe they were brothers. Lucas was all stiff and neat, while Seth had this easy, confident vibe in every move. That night, Lucas holed up in his room with his laptop and a mug of coffee, like always. I stayed in the kitchen and Seth joined me, holding a glass of water. He started asking questions about my job at an ad agency, what I liked watching on weekends, even my go-to coffee. Lucas hadn't asked me anything like that in a couple years. "Don't you ever feel like he's not really with you?" Seth asked, looking at me closely. I nodded before I could stop myself and said quietly, "He used to be there, but now it's like he's after something else." Seth leaned in a little closer and said, "You don't strike me as someone easy to overlook." His words stuck in my head, and I felt my pulse pick up. The next morning, Lucas left early without even saying goodbye to me before heading out. I heard the front door slam shut and stayed alone in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee. He'd mentioned the night before that he had a work meeting downtown in Austin, and I didn't bother asking for details. Over 4 years, I'd gotten used to him being gone, but this time the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. I stared out the window, wondering how we'd ended up like this, when I heard footsteps behind me. Seth walked into the kitchen, barefoot, wearing one of Lucas's old t-shirts that hung a little loose on him. His dark hair fell over his eyes, and he looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. "Good morning, you're up early," I said, trying to sound calm and casual despite feeling off. He smiled, reached for a mug from the cabinet, and replied, "Couldn't sleep, the bed's too big for one person." His voice was soft, but there was a genuine warmth in it that caught my attention. He poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter, and looked at me like he had something to say. I glanced away, feeling tension build between us even though we'd barely spoken. "Are you always this quiet in the mornings?" he asked, taking a sip and keeping his eyes on me. "Not used to having guests, I'm usually alone here," I said, trying to keep my composure. Seth set his mug down and stepped closer, cutting the distance between us to just a couple feet. "Lucas is damn lucky to have you, but he doesn't even see it," he said quietly, locking eyes with me. I froze, unsure how to react, and mumbled, "He used to see it, but that was a while ago." Seth tilted his head, like he was thinking over my words, and added, "Sometimes people stop noticing what's right in front of them." His tone was serious, no hint of joking, and I felt something stir inside me. We stood there for a few seconds, and I noticed how close he'd gotten. I could feel the warmth radiating from him even from that distance. Then the day dragged on slow, and Seth was everywhere, making it impossible to ignore him. He turned on music in the kitchen, humming under his breath while making toast, moving like he'd always lived here. I sat in the living room with my laptop, trying to focus on work, but kept catching myself glancing his way. He noticed once and caught my eye, winking with a small smile. "Don't you ever get bored here alone?" he asked, plopping onto the couch next to me, closer than necessary. "Sometimes you get used to being alone, it starts feeling comfortable," I said, closing my laptop and turning to face him. "What if someone wanted to change that?" he said, looking at me with a mix of curiosity and challenge in his eyes. I swallowed, feeling my heart speed up, and asked, "What are you even talking about?" He smirked and replied, "About how you deserve to be noticed, Ethan." His words hit me hard, so sincere I didn't know how to respond. We sat in silence, and I could feel his gaze on me until he stood up and went to the kitchen for water. Left alone, I tried to figure out why what he said got under my skin so much. By evening, Lucas called and said he'd be out late because of another meeting. I hung up, staring at the phone, feeling the emptiness that had become too familiar. Seth appeared in the living room doorway with a bottle of wine and suggested, "Let's have a drink, he won't be back for a while." I agreed, and we sat out back where the air was warm and smelled like grass. He poured me a glass, his fingers brushing mine as he handed it over. "Do you ever think about what you're missing?" he asked, staring at the sunset. I nodded and said quietly, "Every day, but I don't know how to get it back." He turned to me and said, "Maybe it's closer than you think." We sat out back, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky dark blue. The wine in Seth's glass swayed a little as he leaned over to pour me more. His fingers brushed mine again, and I felt the warmth from that touch spread up my arm. I took a sip, trying to ignore how close he was sitting, but it didn't work. "Do you ever miss how things used to be?" he asked, looking at me with an interest that was hard to miss. I nodded and said quietly, "I miss it every day, but Lucas doesn't see that." He leaned back, holding his glass, and said, "Maybe he doesn't need to see it if you know what you want." His words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, trying to figure out what he meant. Seth set his glass on the little table beside us and slid closer, our knees almost touching now. "I mean it, Ethan, you don't have to just wait for him to wake up," he said, his voice firm but gentle at the same time. I swallowed and mumbled, "I'm married, Seth, it's not as simple as it sounds." He chuckled but didn't move away and replied, "Married doesn't mean happy, you know that better than I do." I didn't have an answer, because he was right, and that scared me more than anything. We went quiet, and I heard a dog barking somewhere far off, breaking the silence between us. Seth kept looking at me, and I felt his stare even without lifting my eyes from my glass. Then he reached out and touched my shoulder lightly, just to get my attention. "Have you ever thought about feeling alive again?" he asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I turned to him and said, "I've thought about it, but I don't know where to start." He gave a small smile and said, "Sometimes all it takes is not saying no." I didn't get to reply because my phone buzzed on the table, Lucas calling. Seth pulled back, but his eyes stayed on me as I picked up. Lucas said he was staying at a hotel downtown since his meeting ran into the morning. I said shortly, "Okay, see you tomorrow," and hung up, feeling something tighten inside me. Seth watched me and asked, "He didn't even check how you're doing?" I shook my head and said, "He hasn't asked in a long time, I'm used to it." Seth stood, grabbed the wine bottle, and nodded toward the house. "Let's go inside, it's getting chilly out here." We moved to the living room, and he turned on the lamp by the couch, filling the room with soft light. I sat on one end, and he settled next to me, stretching his legs onto the coffee table. "Let's play a game," he suggested, turning to me with a slight smile. "What kind of game?" I asked, feeling the tension creep back, but with a different edge now. "Just answer my questions honestly, and I'll do the same," he said, And I agreed, not sure where it'd lead. He started, "What did you feel when I hugged you yesterday?" I hesitated, but said, "Warmth and some surprise, I wasn't expecting it." Seth nodded, like that was the right answer, and leaned a little closer to me. "Your turn to ask," he said, and I thought for a second before asking, "Why do you talk to me so much?" He looked me in the eye and said, "Because you seem like someone who needs to be heard." His words hung there, and I felt my face heat up. We kept asking questions, and with each answer, the space between us shrank. By midnight, he was sitting so close I could feel his breath when he spoke. At one point, he asked, "Would you want me to keep my distance from you?" I looked at him and said honestly, "No, I like that you're here." He smiled and rested his hand on my knee, leaving it there for a few seconds. I moved closer to him, and that was my answer. After Seth took his hand off my knee, we went quiet, but the air in the room felt thicker. The lamp by the couch cast a warm glow on his face, and I noticed how he stared at me, unwavering. I took another sip of wine, trying to calm the nerves that were stretched tight inside me. "You okay?" he asked, leaning a bit closer, his voice softer than usual. I nodded and said, "Yeah, just not used to talking like this with someone." He smiled and replied, "Maybe it's time to get used to it if it's what you've been missing." I looked at him, and there was something in his gray eyes that I couldn't turn away from. We sat there for a few more minutes, and I felt the warmth of his closeness seeping into me slowly. Then he stood up, stretched, and his shirt lifted just enough to show a strip of skin above his jeans. "Gonna grab more wine, you want some?" he asked, heading to the kitchen without waiting for my answer. I stayed on the couch, trying to sort out my thoughts, but everything was jumbled in my head. He came back with the bottle and 2 full glasses, set them on the table, and sat even closer than before. "Let's drink to not being afraid of what we want," he said, raising his glass. I clinked mine against his and mumbled, "Guess that's worth drinking to." We drank in silence, and I noticed his knee was touching mine now, but he didn't move away. "Ever thought about just taking what you need?" he asked, looking at me with a slight squint. I swallowed and said, "I've thought about it, but I don't want to mess everything up." He set his glass down and turned to me fully, resting his arm on the back of the couch behind me. "Sometimes breaking something old is the only way to start over," he said, his voice lower, almost intimate. I felt my breathing pick up and said, "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of step." Seth leaned in closer, and I felt the warmth of his breath on my cheek as he spoke. "You don't have to be sure, you just have to want to try," he whispered, his words sounding like an invitation. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears, unsure what to do next. He waited, not moving, but his hand on the couch back slid slowly to my shoulder. "Tell me to stop and I'll stop," he said, looking straight into my eyes. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, and instead I just stared back at him, not looking away. Then he moved in slow, his lips inches from mine, but he paused, giving me a chance to pull back. I didn't, and he closed the gap, brushing his lips against mine softly. It wasn't rushed or hard, just warm and a feeling I hadn't had in years. I kissed him back without thinking, and his hand settled on the back of my neck, holding me closer. We kissed for a few seconds, and I felt everything inside me wake up, like someone flipped a switch in a dark room. He pulled back, but not far, and whispered, "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that." I stared at him, trying to process what just happened, and said, "I didn't think it'd feel like this." He smiled and replied, "This is what it feels like to live, not just exist." We sat quietly, his hand still on my shoulder, while I tried to figure out what I was feeling. Guilt was there, buried deep, but it was drowned out by a warmth I didn't want to let go. "You won't regret this?" he asked, looking at me with a hint of worry. I shook my head and said, "I don't know, but right now I don't care." We finished the wine, and he suggested going to bed, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easy after that. We went upstairs, and he stopped at his room's door, looking at me. "If you want to talk, I'm here," he said, and I nodded, heading to my bedroom. Lying in the dark, I could still feel his taste lingering, and it hit me harder than I expected. I lay in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, but sleep wouldn't come to me at all. In the dark, I could still feel the warmth from Seth's kiss, and it wouldn't let me rest. The clock on the nightstand showed almost 2 in the morning, and the quiet house only made the noise in my head louder. I got up, paced the room, trying to talk myself into going back to bed and forgetting everything. But instead, I found myself at the door, looking down the hall where a thin line of light slipped out from under Seth's room. I knew I shouldn't do it, but my feet carried me forward anyway. I knocked softly, almost hoping he wouldn't hear and I could just walk away. The door opened a second later, and Seth stood there in a t-shirt and shorts, with a small smile. "Can't sleep?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in without waiting for an answer. I nodded and said, "Can't stop thinking about what happened downstairs." He shut the door behind me, and the room filled with his scent, something fresh, like after a shower. "Me neither," he replied, looking at me like he'd been waiting for this all night. We stood facing each other, and I felt my heart pounding as he took a slow step toward me. "You sure you want to be here?" he asked, resting his hand on my shoulder, his voice soft but serious. I looked into his eyes and said, "Not sure, but I don't want to leave." He nodded, like that was all he needed to hear, and moved closer. His lips found mine again, and this time the kiss was deeper, more insistent than before. I kissed him back, feeling the tension inside me melt into that warmth. His hands slid to my back, pulling me against him, and I felt our bodies press together. We moved slow, like we were testing limits, but each step took us further. I felt his fingers trace along my neck, sending a shiver I couldn't hide. We pulled apart for a second, breathing hard, and he whispered, "You can stop this anytime you want." I shook my head and said, "Don't want to stop, not now." Then it all blurred together. We ended up by the bed, and he gently pushed me down, sitting beside me. His hands found the hem of my shirt, pulling it over my head and tossing it to the floor. I did the same with his, feeling the heat of his skin under my fingers. We didn't talk, but every move made sense without words. He leaned over me, his lips brushing down my neck, leaving a feeling I wouldn't forget. I pulled him closer, and we lay down, tangling together in a way that shut out tomorrow. It wasn't just physical, I could feel him putting something more into every touch, beyond just want. His breath mixed with mine, and I lost myself in it, forgetting Lucas, the guilt, everything. We moved together, finding a rhythm that felt right, and I felt every part of me come alive under his hands. When it was over, we lay side by side, breathing heavy, and he ran his hand across my chest, resting it there. "You okay?" he asked, looking at me with a faint smile. I nodded and said, "More than okay, I didn't expect this." We lay there quiet, and I felt his warmth settle me, despite the storm inside. "You won't regret it?" he asked again, and I turned to him, saying, "Don't know, but it doesn't matter right now." He smiled and shifted closer, wrapping an arm around me like he didn't want to let go. I closed my eyes, feeling him there, and for the first time in ages, I didn't feel empty. Morning came, and I slipped back to my room before he woke up, but what happened that night stayed with me. I woke up in my room that morning, and sunlight was already filtering through the curtains. The clock showed just past 8, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying last night in my head. I could still feel Seth's warmth, his breath, his hands, but now something heavy mixed in with it. I got up, splashed cold water on my face to clear my thoughts, and headed downstairs. The kitchen was quiet, and I figured Seth might still be sleeping after everything. But then I heard footsteps and saw him walk in with a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked relaxed, wearing the same t-shirt from yesterday, hair a little messy. "Morning," he said, setting the mug on the table and giving me a small smile. I nodded and replied, "Morning, you're up early after a night like that." He shrugged and said, "Didn't want to miss the day, especially with you around." His voice was gentle, no pressure behind it, and that eased me a bit. I poured myself coffee, sat across from him, and we just looked at each other for a few seconds. The silence wasn't awkward, it felt comfortable, like we both knew there was no rush to fill it. "You doing okay after everything?" he asked, leaning a little closer across the table, his eyes searching mine. I took a sip of coffee and said, "Yeah, just trying to figure out what I'm feeling now." He nodded, like he expected that, and reached out, brushing his fingers over my hand on the table. You don't have to sort it all out right away, sometimes it's enough to just be here, he said, his touch lingering on my skin. I didn't pull away, feeling his contact steady me despite the mess in my mind. We decided to take our coffee out back, sit there while the morning was still cool. He grabbed an old blanket from the living room, spread it on the grass, and we settled down side by side. I watched the wind move the leaves in the trees, and felt Seth shift closer, but not in a pushy way. Ever just lie out like this, not thinking about anything? He asked, staring up at the sky and resting on his elbows. I smiled and said, used to with Lucas sometimes, but that was a long time ago. He turned to me and said, then let's do it now, just you and me. We lay back, looking at the clouds, and I felt his hand find mine, lacing our fingers together. It wasn't like last night, not intense, but quiet, tender, and it made my chest tighten. You make me feel alive, I said, not looking at him, but squeezing his hand harder. He rolled onto his side, propping his head up, and replied, you are alive, Ethan, someone just had to remind you. His voice was warm, and I turned to him, meeting his gaze, full of something I couldn't name. We stayed like that for a while, and he started talking about how he'd watched the sky as a kid in Dallas. I listened as he shared stories about his old house, and for the first time in forever, I felt at peace. Then he shifted closer, resting his head on my shoulder, and I felt his breath on my neck. You don't have to figure everything out right now, he whispered, and I nodded, sliding my hand onto his back. We just lay there, feeling each other, and it was the best thing I'd felt in years. Later, Lucas called and said he'd be back by lunch, and I felt reality creeping in again. Seth looked at me and asked, you ready for him to come home? I sighed and said, not really, but I don't have a choice. He squeezed my hand one more time and said, I'm here if you need to talk. We got up, folded the blanket, and I realized that moment with him had changed something in me for good. Lucas got home around noon, and I heard his car pull into the garage. I stood in the kitchen, staring at Seth's empty mug still sitting on the table from that morning. My chest tightened as I realized everything with Seth would now have to stay buried deep inside me. He came out of his room just as Lucas walked in, carrying his work bag and tossing his keys on the counter. Hey, how's it going? Lucas said, glancing at me with no real interest, like it was just something to say. I nodded and replied, fine, how'd your day go? He shrugged and said, long but nothing new. Seth stood in the doorway watching us, and I noticed him tense up a little, though he didn't show it. Have a good time here? Lucas asked him, opening the fridge and grabbing a water bottle. Seth smiled and said, yeah, Ethan's a great host, I felt right at home. His voice was steady, but I caught a hidden meaning in his words. Lucas didn't even look at me, just nodded and walked off to the living room with his phone in hand. I stayed in the kitchen with Seth, and he stepped closer, saying quietly, he doesn't even see you're different. I sighed and replied, he hasn't seen me in a long time, I'm used to it. We went out back one last time before Seth had to leave that evening. He sat on the porch steps, and I leaned against the railing, looking down at him. You're heading out in a couple hours, right? I asked, feeling my throat tighten at the thought. He nodded and said, yeah, but I don't want this to be the end, Ethan. I looked at him and asked, what else could it be if not the end? He stood up, walked over and took my hand, squeezing it tight. It could be a start, if you decide not to hide from yourself, he said, his eyes serious. I stayed quiet, feeling his words cut into me, knowing he was right but unsure what to do. I can't just walk away from Lucas, I said finally, looking off to the side. Seth nodded and replied, I'm not asking you to leave, I'm asking you not to forget you're alive. He let go of my hand but stayed close, and we stood there, listening to the wind rustle the leaves. Then he said, I'll leave you my number if you ever want to talk or meet up. I nodded, and he scribbled it on a scrap of paper I tucked into my pocket. When it was time, I helped him pack his stuff, and we stood by his car out front. Lucas didn't even come out to say goodbye, too busy with something in his room. Seth looked at me and said, don't let him erase what you felt with me. I nodded and replied, I won't forget, I promise. He hugged me tight but quick, and got in the car. I watched him drive off until his taillights disappeared around the corner, then went back inside, feeling empty and warm at the same time. A week passed, and I sat in my room, staring at that scrap of paper with Seth's number. Lucas was the same, distant, busy, not seeing me. I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I didn't call Seth, but I started thinking about what I really wanted. This was my ending with him, but maybe the start of something new for me. Now, friends, I've got some questions for you. What would you do in my shoes? Would you call Seth or leave things as they are with Lucas? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear what you think. And one more thing. Has anything like this ever happened to you, where you felt alive again? Share your stories. I'll read every single one.